The old psoas. Either you love them or hate them. For the longest time, the psoas has been one of the biggest talks in the fitness and rehab industry as being the source of your low back pain, the source of your hip dysfunction. I, for one, think the psoas is a very important muscle. It's a quite large muscle that stabilizes the spine and the hip. When it comes to dysfunction within this muscle, meaning the psoas isn't doing its job, we often hear mixed things on social media. Maybe people think, oh, your psoas feels stiff because it's weak, or your psoas is way too overactive and it's causing stiffnesses in your spine. So what is it? Is it too weak, or is it too strong and you need to just stretch it? And the answer is always more nuanced. But in my opinion, you're going to have an inhibited muscle if it can't fully experience length in all three planes of motion. And we'll get into what that means when we describe the anatomy of the psoas. But my goal with this video is to get you to understand the biomechanics and the anatomy associated with the psoas and how we can fully get length or stretch this muscle in all three planes of motion. Now, to keep it simple, we're going to talk about the psoas major. You have a psoas major and minor. The psoas major is going to connect from the spine to the femur, whereas the minor will just connect to the pelvis. So it's just going to have a predominant action on the spine. Now, we can see the origin of the psoas. It's going to span the entire lumbar vertebrae and the very bottom of the thoracic vertebrae on the transverse process, very close to the outside edge of the spine. And it's going to come down in sort of an S shape as it attaches into the lesser trochanter of the femur. So it attaches onto the inside part of the femur. Now, with this kind of S shape of the muscle, we can now see how it'll have different actions in different planes of motion. It's not just a linear muscle. So oftentimes people just think the psoas is a hip flexor. So it brings the knee toward the chest. So in order to get length into this muscle, all you have to do is bring the femur into extension or tuck the pelvis under into a posterior pelvic tilt, which is a relative hip extension. But we can do better than that. We can get a much stronger lengthening sensation by adding different planes of motion into the mix. So because it attaches to the inside of the femur, if we create a bit of external rotation, some lateral rotation of the femur as the foot moves outwards, we could get a little bit more length through this distal end here. Now, also what can happen is a closed kinetic chain external rotation where the pelvis will rotate away from the femur. Now, some anatomy textbooks will tell you the femur is an external rotator very slightly. It's not its predominant action, but the femur only contributes to some external rotation above 90 degrees of flexion. So when it's in extension, it's not going to have that action. Also, abduction of the hip is going to lengthen it slightly as well because of this inside attachment. As this leg travels outside, this starts to pull even more. What is also an abduction, and especially this becomes important when we're talking about closed kinetic chain. So when the feet are on the ground, when you're walking, gait cycle. As this pelvis hikes on this side, if the pelvis were to hike here, that is an adduction of the femur. If the pelvis hikes on this side, what we get is a drop on this side, and that will be an abduction of the femur. So we have an adduction and abduction. Abduction will get length through this psoas. So as this pelvis hikes, maybe that'll look like this. You could see this side is higher, this side is lower. You could see how this will pull more. It'll bring the origin and insertion further away from each other. And of course, we're going to go over examples of all of this. So here's the frontal plane. We have a pelvic hike, and then we have the transverse plane. We have a little bit of external rotation. And you can tell, if you bring your leg behind you and you rotate your pelvis in the same direction as the femur, then you come off stretch. So you'll see this in a half kneeling hip flexor stretch. If we were to rotate the pelvis toward the stretching side leg, we significantly come off tension. But if we allow that femur to move back in space, and then we rotate the pelvis away, we could feel that psoas stretching way more through that transverse plane interaction. If we allow the pelvis to hike on that opposite side, we get a greater stretch. Now we can create a hike of the pelvis by simply just doing that through the use of our QL, or we can add a side bend into our stretches, which closes down the opposite side and forces a hike on that opposing side. When we side bend, we create a dropping of the pelvis on the stretching side, which is that abduction of the femur that we're looking for, relatively. Now we need to talk about the sagittal plane, which is often misunderstood because this is a really important part of stretching the psoas because its primary motion is through the sagittal plane. It does do hip flexion. So oftentimes people think we need to keep this strong posterior pelvic tilt. And this is because this is hip extension. The psoas does hip flexion, but it also does trunk flexion. We have to remember that. So if we fully posterior pelvic tilt, what does that do to the trunk? It flexes the lumbar spine. So we're actually shortening the proximal attachment. If we want to extend the trunk to get a stretch, we need to get this spinal extension to stretch it. People are very afraid of anterior pelvic tilt, but we need some degree of it to get a stretch through the psoas. When I overly anterior tilt and just dump at the low back, you could see all that does is it faces the pelvis toward the ground. It points it down, and that isn't true hip extension. Okay, the femur is staying fixed, but the low back is just overly arching. And now, this just shortens the psoas and doesn't get any length. So we have to be careful. We don't want over anterior pelvic tilt, and we don't overly want a posterior pelvic tilt, because this shortens the proximal end and this shortens the distal end. So what we want is to keep the pelvis as neutral as possible so we can have a shifting forward of the pelvis in space as we extend the trunk and keep some hip extension on this back leg. Because if we think of the opposing direction, hip flexion, a true hip flexion where we send the hip back and the torso moves forward, we want to do the opposite of that. We want to send the pelvis forward and the torso back. This is different than just anteriorly tilting the pelvis. Can you see the difference there? The hip is almost still behind my sternum here, whereas now the hip is in front. So we're going to see how we can leverage this when we get into two of my favorite stretches for the psoas. Okay, the barbell kneeling long lunge. Hopefully you've seen this a lot on my channel. You could see as I just arch at the back, I'm not getting good length here, but the spine is still in extension. As we elevate this back knee, you could see my low back is arched, and the elevation of the back knee prepositions the femur in extension, and then we can leverage the stretch through torso extension. So as I push my pelvis forward, I'm actually trying to keep a strong glute contraction to posteriorly tilt the pelvis while my spine is in extension. This prevents excessive anterior pelvic tilt. So I'm really squeezing my upper back and my lats, these spinal extensor muscles that do help facilitate a stretch through the psoas. So this is one of my favorite loaded stretches. Okay, this is another half kneeling variation with almost the opposite intent of the other one. So we're going to elevate the front leg as opposed to elevating the back leg, and you can see how this makes the pelvis much more level from the start. So I'm going to use an overhead load here to further emphasize spinal extension. You can see as I shift my hip forward, the weight of that kettlebell is now moving directly down over the back of the hip, pushing my hip down into extension. Now we can even pick up the back knee here, squeeze the glute, and get a nice isometric overhead stretch here. and you can see the pelvis is staying really level. Now, what I also really like about the front foot elevation is it hikes the pelvis. So it doesn't just posteriorly tilt the pelvis, but it actually hikes the pelvis on that opposite side, giving us that relative adduction on the stretching side. So we almost get a side bending effect to fully stretch the psoas in the frontal plane. So there you have it, guys. There's the deep dive on the psoas muscle. So next time you go to your physical therapist for low back pain, hip pain, hell, even shoulder pain, and they tell you you have a tight psoas, now you understand some of the biomechanics and anatomy associated with this muscle and what you could do to make sure that you can lengthen it. Now, like I described, an inhibited muscle, a weak muscle, is first and foremost one that can't experience length in all three planes of motion. I went through two of my favorite loaded stretches for the psoas muscle. Remember, just stretching it probably does nothing, but if you stretch it under load and external force, you can create some strength through that muscle at length, as well as get leverage to stretch it in ways you probably haven't experienced before. So I highly recommend you give these two exercises a try. If you like the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I like to do a lot of deep dives like this, as well as address common problems with some outside-of-the-box solutions. If you want me to make a deep dive video on any other muscle, please let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay supple.